Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the very first episode of the Rambling History Podcast. I am Zach, and I'm joined here by Joseph.
Hello there, I am Joseph.
And today we're going to be rambling about the Soviet-Japanese border conflicts, which are a relatively little-known series of conflicts and battles in between the period of 1935 to 1939 between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan and their respective puppet states of Mongolia and Manchukuo.
And what should be noted about this is that when we say conflicts, we mean roughly 2 to 5 to 20 people meeting in the middle of nowhere and running away or killing each other.
A lot of these conflicts, we only know they exist because of diplomatic communications between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan on the subject of returning the dead bodies. There were two series of major battles fought, one at Lake Khasin and one at Khalkhin Gol. Those were in the later period of the conflict.
With most of the conflict in the earlier years mainly consisting of, as I previously stated, small conflicts mainly fought between either Mongolian cavalry and Manchukuo patrols, or NKVD assets, again meeting with Manchukuo forces. No big army conflicts really existed before 1939, roughly.
Like, one of the earliest recorded conflicts, the Battle of Khalkhin Temple, that's generally considered the starting period of the border conflicts. It was fought in January of 1935 between a few dozen Mongolian cavalry troops and somewhere around 30 or 40 Manchukuo infantrymen. They fought near a Buddhist temple located northwest of Buer Lake. I think that's how you pronounce that. It's
it's all Japanese and Chinese, so the pronunciation probably won't be exactly accurate, but
yes. And the important thing to note about these conflicts was that the borders between Mongolia and the Soviet Union and Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state in Manchuria, the borders in between those states were extremely poorly defined.
the borders were established during the time of the Qing Empire and the Russian Empire, meaning back when borders were already extremely undefined and those two had antagonism between each other, which also led to further issues. And of course, you can't expect two empires that basically, or two nations that basically don't have anything to do with the previous nations to entirely follow the border treaties.
And I believe it has been proposed that in some instances the border markers were missing or possibly tampered with.
Yeah.
I don't know if those are confirmed, but there have been some rumors to that effect.
And I'd probably say it's impossible to confirm that, as those things are mainly... They would be reports from patrols, which can't be trusted considering the biases of both sides at the time. Considering they were both looking for a just cause to get more territory.
That is a fair assumption to make, given the time period and the context. So both sides claim a large number of, several hundred incidents of various troops and patrols. But things really only get notable in 1937 with the Kanchazu Island incident, which occurred in late June 1937 on the Emmer River. Which was right on the Soviet-Manchukuo border.
This being more on the Mongolian side of the border. So, if you were thinking Manchukuo, you'd basically be thinking northeast, because that was where the river was flowing, from memory.
Yes. Kenchazu Island is an unoccupied island in the center of the river that officially acted as the border between Manchuria and the USSR. And on the 19th of June, two Soviet motorboats crossed the center line of the river and offloaded a small number of troops onto the island. The Manchurians, overseen by Japanese advisors, investigated the reports of Soviet incursion as the Soviets were establishing minor fortifications on the island. And there was an exchange of fire. The Manchurians were withdrawn following this incident. They came back a few days later, armed with horse-drawn artillery pieces, and opened fire on the Soviet positions, destroying the gunboats that the Soviets were using to support their troops on the island. Following the loss of the boats, the Soviets abandoned the island, and the Japanese claimed victory. Following the battle, there was a diplomatic engagement between, and I'm going to mispronounce this name here, Shigemitsu Memaru, the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union, met with Maxim Litivnov on the 29th of June, 1937, to discuss the circumstances of the conflict, and came to a diplomatic ceasefire on the subject, and both sides withdrew their forces. And that was really the first major engagement of the conflict.
First notable one where I'd at least say firepower above machine gun level was used.
Yes, with
which, in my opinion, is where an actual battle.
Employment of gunboats by the Soviets and the 37mm artillery pieces by the Japanese showed a clear escalation of the conflict.
Although I wouldn't say 37mm is really artillery, but that's just the Japanese being...
Hey, 37mm is a perfectly good caliber for certain uses. And at the time, it was, 1937, it's a perfectly respectable artillery piece for the time.
As an anti-tank artillery piece, sure, but I wouldn't say it would be useful as a actual infantry. Well, as an infantry support gun, I guess you could argue it, but medium artillery or above.
It's a good light artillery piece. And then, the next conflict of major note was the Battle of Lake Kassan in July and August of 1938, which was a military incursion by Manchukuo forces, led by the Japanese, into territory claimed by the Soviet Union. There was a disagreement over the exact meaning of a treaty between Imperial Russia and the Qing dynasty of China over the territory around Lake Kassan.
Yeah, and this territory, of course, was, as a lot of territories were at this time, mainly demarked by actual posts, and those posts were claimed to have been tampered with, removed, or changed, which led to the Japanese claiming that the territory was theirs and sending in forces to attempt to take it over.
And they did this with the Kwangtung Army. Was that what the Manchurian military was called, if I recall correctly?
It was the Kwangtung Army, which was mainly just it was basically you could use the word warlord, I guess. It was basically just the Japanese Imperial Army, which had the majority of the control in Manchukuo and hence the army there, and operated very autonomously from the Imperial High Command in Tokyo, which of course was in northern Japan.
A lot of that lack of control from Tokyo is why a lot of these conflicts occurred in the first place. And we'll talk.
The
I'm sure we'll talk about the Japanese takeover of Manchuria in 1931 in a later episode. But that entire thing basically happened because one military officer in Japan decided to take matters into his own hands and invaded.
yeah, good old
But
Bushido.
the conflict at Lake Khasan began with Japanese and Manchurians were moving into the area around Lake Khasan, and the Soviets responded to this by moving their own troops into the area and attempting to fortify some of the territory. Conflict really
Yeah.
began when the Japanese when a Japanese diplomat demanded that Soviet border troops be removed from the region, and the demand was rejected, which led to the Manchurians and Japanese opening fire on the Soviets and attempting to claim the fortified Soviet territory. Successfully so. The Japanese launched a night attack on July 31st, which routed the Soviet troops and claimed several tanks that the Soviets had deployed in the region. These were small tanks like the T-26, for example, the BT-7, some self-propelled artillery pieces, that kind of thing.
This
The
obviously being an
T-34
example.
and stuff weren't in service yet, so there were, light tanks.
This should be served as an example, of course, of Japanese Bushido spirit prevailing overall,
Yes,
including Russian army. Yeah, no, they were successful.
that was
Very good, even.
Yeah, it was a night surprise attack against a fortified position.
And a massacre, should be noted.
Yeah, the Soviets completely routed. And following the rout of the Soviet fortified troops, the Japanese and Manchurians moved more troops into the area, and the Soviets prepared for a counterattack, including something like 350 tanks and assault guns, some artillery, some self-propelled artillery pieces, as well as gathering, regular infantry and aircraft as well. The final total of troops involved in the conflict was something like 23,000 for the Soviets and somewhere around 7,000 Manchurians and Japanese.
Yeah. What should be noted about the deployment of the Soviet forces was that, at least in the early parts of the battle, they were relatively unsupported armor-wise because the infantry wasn't properly deployed to operate in combined arms formations, which obviously can be accredited to the purge.
Now, the Soviets launched their counterattack in early August, somewhere around August 10th or 9th. The Soviets launched their counterattack, but these attacks were not successful and incurred significant losses to the Soviet troops, mainly due to poor planning and the fortifications that these Japanese had put in place for many of these fortifications designed specifically to defeat tanks, which cost the Soviets a significant part of their advantage with armored support. The conflict came to a conclusion on August 11th through a diplomatic agreement, as it was clear to all sides involved that despite the Soviets' failure to reclaim the fortified territory, the Japanese and Manchurians would not be able to hold the territory without escalating the conflict. And that was not something either side was prepared to do at the time, so they brought it. So the Soviets, the Japanese and Manchurians retreated and allowed the Soviets to reclaim the fortified territory.
Yes, and by the reclamation, it could be said at least that this also left a probable resentment in the officer corps of the actual Imperial Japanese Army, because as we previously mentioned, they were not exactly on the same page as the diplomats in Tokyo. And this probably can credit some of the further escalation that happened afterwards in the Battle of Cotton Goal, which we're going to talk about after this, probably.
And the Soviets lost somewhere around 800 troops killed and a little over 3,000 wounded. According to Japanese records, they claim to have knocked out just under 100 tanks. The validity of that source is somewhat questionable, perhaps, just due to the difficulties of confirming various claims. Japanese casualties are believed to be somewhere around 500 killed and around 1,000 wounded. Following the battle, several thousand Soviet officers were issued various awards and medals, including around 30 officers were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, which is a fairly significant medal. The loss of so many Soviet troops was largely blamed on an officer by the name of Vasily Blucher.
Blücher.
Yes.
It's a German name.
Yes. He was in the command of the Far East military forces at the time. Following his inability to decisively defeat the Japanese, he was withdrawn from command from of the Far East troops, and believe he was purged became a victim of the Great Purge for his inability to decisively defeat the Japanese.
Oh yes, by the way, I had to point this out because I was looking into it. This Glorious Hero of the Soviet Union award also has such figures like Beria,
Yes.
a good friend. La friendly Beria.
Yes. It also includes the Mexican guy that murdered Trotsky, but that's not what we're here to talk about at the moment. But
yeah, we were talking about the actual aftermath of this battle event.
Following later on in 1946 at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, 13 Japanese officers were charged with crimes against peace for their roles in the conflict at Lake Khasan. Following Lake Khasan, the conflict somewhat cooled for a while. Neither side prepared to escalate the conflict again until 1939 with the battles around the river of Khalkhin Gol. And the battles at Khalkhin Gol lasted from 11th of May to the 15th of September 1939, which were fairly significant conflict. They were the last major battles of the war. Undeclared war, we'll say.
Declared enough to have people die for it, but yes, you're correct.
It was also the most major battle of the conflict, with somewhere between 60 and 70,000 troops deployed by the Soviet Union and the Mongolian People's Republic, and somewhere around 30 to 40,000 deployed by the Empire of Japan and Manchukuo. This conflict also included several hundred tanks and armored cars, several hundred aircraft, artillery pieces, cavalry forces, motorized units. It was a fairly significant battle. Not as significant as later battles of the Second World War would be, but it was by far the most significant battle and largest battle of the border conflicts.
And sporting a relatively large variety of combined forces, which would obviously lead our hero Zhukov to perfect his tactical skills, strategical skills, which we'll later talk about in the actual battle strategy.
We'll probably have to do a video just on Zhukov, to be honest, among other major generals. But it is
that's going to be a
worth
great one.
noting that the Battle of Khalkhin Gol was Gregory Zhukov employed many of his combined arms tactics, the same sort of combined arms tactics that would later make German generals such as Rommel and Guderian famous for blitzkrieg. I say that somewhat sarcastically, because the term blitzkrieg was never used in warfare. It was used by media. It was used by newspapers to describe the conflict.
The tactic would be more accurately described as a Schwerpunkt followed by simple exploitation.
Yes.
Which he, of course, our hero, our Kami,
Zhukov
exploited.
Decisively used at Khalkhin Gol. But we'll get to that. The conflict began with the Manchurians and Japanese. They pushed into the region around the river Khalkhin Gol, following instructions to better fortify the Soviet border because hostilities between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan were continuing to rise. Japanese and Manchurians moved to fortify the area around Khalkhin Gol, and the Mongolian military and the Soviet army moved to counter this attempt at fortification, which led to minor skirmishes in the month of May. And during June, the conflict continued to escalate with more troops being moved in, airstrikes began to be carried out.
And very interestingly, this conflict had a very modern show of air combat, with it progressing, it started a bit earlier than the official, at least the ground battle started. And losses-wise, it was a very large scale, I guess, for the size of for the time. It was a pretty large scale air battle that at least showed the incompetency of the Soviet armed forces, or these aerial forces after the purge, and could have been a sign for the Soviet High Command of things to come, but they didn't really work on it, I feel, to what they could have done.
Yes, it was a fairly significant conflict in the air. Again, we brought up earlier, it was significant with the armored division, but it was also fairly significant for aircraft. It showed a lot of fairly modern conflicts in both the air and the armored divisions. And then in July, the Japanese launched their attack in the region, which included their tank forces, included their infantry troops, supported by aircraft. It was a fairly good attempt at combined arms warfare. They pushed into the region around Khalkhin Gol, fought a fairly significant battle around it. The Japanese assault petered out towards the end of July, mainly due to incurred losses, as the Soviets had an easier time replacing theirs. And then in August, Zhukov planned and launched a major offensive using a large supply of supply trucks to support his armored forces and motorized infantry in a major blitzkrieg-esque mobile attack to outmaneuver the Japanese forces.
Yeah. And hopefully, or at least hopefully what it did, the combined application of armored cars and infantry, allowing those to properly support the armor, and stop enemy or Japanese essentially suicide attacks from destroying those tanks, which led to a lot of the losses during the Battle of Lake Khasan. Allowed the high maneuverability and, of course, the the toughness of the force to properly encircle the Japanese forces, and through that showing what proper modern warfare could be like. As through the usage of multiple regiments of infantry, armored brigades, heavy artillery to properly shell the enemy before the attack, and at least they had later on in the battle proper air superiority, but early on they didn't really have it. But when they did achieve it, they properly managed to exploit that to really check the Japanese in one position and really succeed relatively to their earlier failures.
And that employment of very modern combined arms warfare tactics allowed Zhukov to decisively encircle the Japanese and Manchukuo forces in a double envelopment maneuver that allowed them to completely encircle the Japanese and Manchukans, and led to a decisive victory for the Soviet forces that led to the Japanese High Command admitted defeat, and they signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, following the aftermath of Khalkhin Gol, that assured Japanese neutrality throughout the throughout the Eastern Front of the Second World War. The Japanese losses during the conflict at Khalkhin Gol were somewhere around 9,000 killed, somewhere around 9,000 wounded, and somewhere around 3,000 taken prisoner. A large number of tanks and aircraft were lost. The Soviets lost somewhere around 30,000 casualties, counting both dead and missing. And they, as well as several hundred tanks, aircraft, and armored cars and artillery were lost. And it's worth noting that a significant number of the tanks the Soviets lost were in fact lost to what is commonly known as a Molotov cocktail, incendiary bomb, thrown by infantry.
Which came from previously noted, I call them suicide attacks, because most of those squads were fueled by
suicide.
Most
did
of those
tend
squads
to end poorly for these soldiers involved, but what would happen, and this is a trick that was learned during the Spanish Civil War, was infantry would throw a vial, or not a vial, like a bottle or a jar full of incendiary liquid like gasoline and oil, with a flaming rag attached, onto the engine deck of the tank, and the burning liquid would screw up the internal workings of the engine and the exhaust systems, and that would cause the tank to break down. And a significant number of the tanks lost were lost to that, while the majority were lost to anti-tank guns and artillery pieces.
Well, Japanese, as we previously mentioned, Japanese anti-tank pieces weren't exactly the most excellent ones, but as we established, they were fine for anti-tank usage. But what should be pointed out too was the performance of Japanese heavy artillery compared to the Soviet heavy artillery and mortars. Because the Soviets had a general doctrine of, well, if you compare the general ranges and calibers, you would look at 152, 122 millimeter Soviet guns and 120 millimeter mortars, contrary to 75 millimeter, or I think at most had like a 105 millimeter artillery gun, the Japanese.
At this point in time, I believe so.
Yeah, the range differences and general caliber differences and even the quantity of differences made it so that the Japanese weren't actually able to, at any satisfactory level, counter Soviet bombardments, which allowed the heavy disruption and elimination of the Japanese fortifications and hence allowed the shock movements of Zhukov's forces to operate as effectively as they did, which is something that he also took into account. Well, he took into his strategy when using it against the Germans later on in the war.
Most notably at Stalingrad.
Yeah.
And Zhukov himself earned his first Hero of the Soviet Union award for the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. Following the battle, he was transferred back to the Western Front. He would use his experience he gained at Khalkhin Gol with combined arms and such he would put that into practice at the Battle of Moscow during their counteroffensives near the end of 1941 in December, as well as we previously mentioned, at Stalingrad.
He also used it at Leningrad, I'm pretty sure, for the eventual counterattacks. And, well, at least Bagration had a counteroffensive that was very similar in style, but I'm not sure about Leningrad.
Yeah, but that was 1944, wasn't it? Or
yeah, no, that was more Armed Group Center, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe that's a different army group. But the Soviets learned a lot from the battles of Khalkhin Gol. It led to significant reforms within the military, particularly armor and the Air Force, because of their respective performances. Led to significant changes in the theories of warfare, as we mentioned with combined arms.
Yeah.
On the Japanese side, it led to the introduction of new anti-tank weapons. The Type 147mm anti-tank gun was introduced. The Type 97 Chaiha tank was introduced following the conflict, following this Japanese experiences against Soviet tanks.
As you previously mentioned, the Kwantung Army and the general Japanese army before this experienced general success when they were ignoring their orders from Tokyo. We had the 1941 invasion, you had further escalation of the battles here, general performance in China.
It's important to note that Japan, over every other power during the Second World War in that period, the Empire of Japan and its army and its military placed extreme importance on initiative over all else.
Yeah.
One of their biggest issues they had when fighting the Chinese during the Second Sino-Japanese War was these Japanese would go in such offensive. They would go into such offensive tactics. The problem was they constantly outran their supply lines and then got counterattacked by massed Chinese troops, which the Chinese found to be fairly effective at stalling and defeating Japanese incursions. The Japanese were constantly outrunning their supply lines. They were constantly overextending. And it came back to bite them in the ass quite frequently, but it also worked quite frequently for the simple reason that it was surprising. By constantly taking the initiative, they constantly had their opponents on the back foot, and it worked with, we'll say, mixed results. And the battle at Khalkhin Gol, as Josef was saying, led to a significant change in the command mindset of the Japanese.
Yeah, indeed. There was one of the biggest examples being that the Japanese, at least, there was a big split, as should be noted, and we'll probably get into in a later date, a big split between the Japanese army and the Japanese navy. Both factions that had a lot of influence inside the government, and as I would say essentially controlled it, but there was no unity between it. And before this, the general consensus was that a Imperial Japanese army strike into Soviet Russia and further into China was the way to go. But this defeat showed that the Imperial Japanese army was not capable of actually attaining its ambitious goals, which should be seen with, obvious results in the eventual strike at Pearl Harbor, combined, of course, with the American blockade of the fuel and further escalation like Japan leaving the League of Nations and further stuff like that.
Um, and the defeat at Khalkhin Gol played a significant part, in my opinion, in pushing for the naval aspect, which led to the Japanese pursuing expansion into Southeast Asia with their invasions of the Philippines, Dutch Indonesia,
The Philippines, Dutch Indies. We also have general Thailand,
Indochina, and of their, as Joseph said, their eventual strike at Pearl Harbor. Another important aspect of the war was the Japanese discovered following Khalkhin Gol that they had an extreme problem with issuing first aid. First aid training was lacking. It required explicit permission from an officer to apply first aid to a soldier, which led to a large portion, a disproportionate amount, I would say, of the Japanese dead dying because no one treated their wounds, as well as fairly lacking cleanliness standards, which led to a lot of deaths from dysentery. And it was found that Japanese rations and supply lines for food and such were not satisfactory.
Yeah, most of the most of Japanese supply lines were at the time primarily still horse driven. Well, most of the supplies were brought through horse, which obviously led to slow issues.
Almost
if you were...
all of the Japanese supplies were horse driven.
And
if I
of
recall
course,
correctly, the trucks that that Zhukov used to facilitate his combined arms attack, his supply trucks, the Japanese actually estimated he used something like 5 times the number of trucks that he did, because they didn't have experience with motorized supply lines.
Yeah, and this obvious lack, combined with the fact that Japanese airports were not up to standards compared to Soviet airports, at least. After the escalation and improvements of the general situation on the Soviet front after Zhukov took control, Japanese airports and general supply capabilities for their armored and Air Force components led to a lot of mechanical failures too, which the Soviets, of course, having to, but had relatively fewer of. And this allowed, of course, a greater commitment of strength to the battle.
And the most significant result of the battles at Khalkhin Gol and at Lake Khasan and the border conflicts in general was the eventual signing of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, which I mentioned earlier, which brought hostilities between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan to a close until 1945, when the Soviet Union would break the pact by invading Manchuria and helping to further the complete defeat of the Empire of Japan in the Second World War.
Essentially taking land in one swift battle.
Obviously, the most significant result of the Neutrality Pact was it ensured that the Soviet Union's far eastern flank was secure during their war with Nazi Germany during World War II. I believe that's all we really have to cover on the Soviet-Japanese border war.
What is the time for that?
The border conflicts were fought between 1935 and 1939. The Neutrality Pact was signed in 1941.
Yeah, I do feel that this topic could be expanded upon, but it would require probably some more purchasing of specific literature.
It would require very specific research. I agree. So, I've been Zach, and this has been my co-host Joseph.
And I would ask you politely to put your feedback in the comments so we can possibly look back on this. The next topic, which will at least in my opinion, I'm going to suggest we're going to do something about the medieval era.
I would agree. We
change of
could
pace.
change pace, head back, probably around the Crusades.
Oh, that's going to be a fun one. Alright, yeah. So I would
So
say
this
that's going
has
to be our
been Zach and Josef. We've been rambling about history, and we will see you all sometime next week.